In 1421, a massive Chinese fleet set sail from Nanjing, over 300 ships. Nearly 30,000 men, vessels that were 5 times larger than anything Europeans had ever built. These ships traveled to Africa, possibly to Australia, maybe even to the Americas, 70 years before Columbus. They had technology that wouldn't appear in Europe for centuries. Watertight compartments, advanced compasses, detailed star charts. And then suddenly, China destroyed the entire fleet. They burned the ships. They executed the admiral. They made it illegal to build ocean-going vessels. They erased the records. Within a generation, China went from having the most advanced navy in human history to having almost no navy at all. And this wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate choice. This is just one example of a pattern that happened over and over in Chinese history. Revolutionary inventions that could have transformed the world, and then were deliberately abandoned, suppressed, or forgotten. This is the story of the lost Chinese inventions. And the question that haunts historians: what if China hadn't stopped? Before we talk about what China lost, let's talk about what they invented. Because most people have no idea how far ahead China was. For most of human history, roughly from 500 CE to 1500 CE, China was the most technologically advanced civilization on Earth. It wasn't even close. Here's a quick list of things China invented centuries before anyone else. Paper, invented around 100 CE. Europe didn't get paper until the 1100s, over 1,000 years later. Printing. Woodblock printing around 600 CE, movable type printing around 1040 CE. Gutenberg's printing press in Europe, that was 1440. China had been mass-producing books for 400 years already. Gunpowder, invented around 850 CE. Europeans didn't develop gunpowder weapons until the 1300s, 4 centuries later. The compass, invented around 200 BCE for navigation by the 1000s CE. Europeans got it in the late 11th century. Porcelain, silk production, the wheelbarrow, the blast furnace, the iron plow, the mechanical clock, paper money. All Chinese inventions, all centuries ahead of Europe. But here's what's really stunning. China didn't just invent these technologies earlier. They often invented them, used them for a while, and then stopped using them. Not because the technology failed, but because they chose to abandon it. And there's one invention that perfectly illustrates this pattern. An invention so advanced, so revolutionary, that if China had kept developing it, world history would look completely different. I'm talking about Zheng He's treasure fleet. And the story of what happened to it explains everything about China's lost potential. Let me tell you about Zheng He, because his story is almost unbelievable. Zheng He was born in 1371 in Yunnan province. He was a Muslim. At age 10, he was captured by the Ming army, castrated, and made into a eunuch servant for the imperial court. Brutal, yes, but this was common practice in Ming China. Despite this horrific beginning, Zheng He rose through the ranks to become one of the most trusted admirals of the Yongle Emperor. And in 1405, the emperor gave him an extraordinary mission. Build the greatest fleet in history and sail it to the edges of the known world. What Zheng He built was staggering. The treasure ships, the flagships of the fleet, were about 400 feet long. For perspective, Columbus's Santa Maria was 85 feet long. Zheng He's ships were nearly 5 times larger. These weren't just big, they were technologically advanced. They had watertight compartments. If one section flooded, the ship wouldn't sink. Multiple masts with advanced sail configurations, sophisticated rudders for steering, magnetic compasses for navigation, detailed nautical charts. The fleet included over 300 vessels, treasure ships, supply ships, water tankers, troop transports, patrol boats. Nearly 30,000 sailors, soldiers, diplomats, and merchants. Between 1405 and 1433, Zheng He made 7 epic voyages. He sailed to Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Peninsula, and East Africa. Some historians argue he reached Australia and possibly even the Americas, though this is debated. But here's what's undeniable. China had the capability to colonize the world. They had the ships, the navigation technology, the manpower, the wealth. They could have established trade routes, colonies, and dominance across the globe. Europe was centuries away from having anything comparable. When Zheng He was sailing to Africa in ships carrying thousands of men, Europeans were still making short coastal trips in tiny vessels. If China had continued these voyages, the age of exploration would have been Chinese, not European. The colonial empires would have been Chinese, not British or Spanish. The global economy would have been centered in Beijing, not London or New York. But that's not what happened. In 1433, Zheng He died, and immediately everything changed. The new Confucian officials at court convinced the emperor that these voyages were a waste of money. They argued China should focus inward, not outward. Maritime trade was beneath the dignity of the Middle Kingdom, so they stopped. They didn't just stop building ships, they actively destroyed what they'd built. They burned the treasure fleet. They destroyed the navigation records. They made it illegal to build ocean-going vessels. Anyone caught building a ship with more than 2 masts could be executed. Within 1 generation, China went from having the most powerful navy in human history to having almost no navy at all. And this raises the question, why? Why would you deliberately destroy your own technological advantage? The destruction of Zheng He's fleet wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that repeated throughout Chinese history. And understanding this pattern explains one of history's biggest mysteries. Why did China fall behind? Let me give you more examples. Example 1. Mechanical clocks. China invented mechanical clocks in the 700s CE, centuries before Europe. The most famous was built by Su Song in 1092, a 30-foot tall astronomical clock tower that tracked the movements of stars and planets with incredible precision. But after the Song dynasty fell in 1279, these clocks were abandoned. The knowledge was lost. When Jesuit missionaries brought European clocks to China in the 1600s, the Chinese emperor was fascinated by technology his own ancestors had invented 500 years earlier. Example 2, blast furnaces and steel production. By 1078 CE, China was producing about 125,000 tons of iron per year, using advanced blast furnaces. Britain didn't reach that level until 1788, 700 years later. But China's iron production actually declined after the Song dynasty. The technology was there, but the interest wasn't. Example 3. Gunpowder weapons. China invented gunpowder in the 800s and developed guns, cannons, and rockets by the 1200s. But they never fully developed these weapons for warfare the way Europeans eventually did. When Europeans came to China in the 1800s with modern guns and cannons, they used technology based on Chinese inventions, but refined and advanced far beyond what China had done. So what's the pattern here? Why did China keep inventing revolutionary technology and then abandoning it? 3 reasons. Reason 1. Confucian philosophy. Confucian scholars who ran the imperial bureaucracy valued agriculture, scholarship, and stability. They looked down on merchants, trade, and technological innovation as vulgar and destabilizing. In the Confucian worldview, the ideal society looked backward to a golden age, not forward to progress. Reason 2. Self-sufficiency. China was enormous, wealthy, and largely self-sufficient. They didn't need to trade with other countries. They didn't need to conquer new territories. Why invest in expensive technology for exploration or trade when you already have everything you need? Reason 3. Centralized control. China's imperial system gave enormous power to the emperor and his bureaucrats. If the emperor or the court decided something was a waste of resources, they could simply shut it down. There was no competing power structure, no merchants, no independent cities, no rival kingdoms to keep innovation alive when the central government lost interest. Compare this to Europe. Europe was politically fragmented. Dozens of competing kingdoms, city-states, and merchant republics. If one king said, "We're not funding ocean exploration," another king would say, "Great, we'll do it and get rich." Competition drove innovation. China had no such competition. When the emperor said stop, everyone stopped. And this brings us to the most heartbreaking lost invention of all, one that could have jump-started the Industrial Revolution 300 years early. In the 1st century CE, a Chinese inventor named Hero of Alexandria, actually the Chinese had their own version, created a basic steam engine. It was a toy, a novelty called an aeolipile, a spinning ball powered by steam jets. The Chinese knew about steam power. They had the metallurgy to build pressure vessels. They had the mechanical knowledge to build pistons and cylinders. But they never developed it. The steam engine remained a curiosity, a toy for entertaining the emperor's court. Fast forward to the 1700s in Britain. The Industrial Revolution begins with the development of practical steam engines, first for pumping water out of mines, then for powering factories, then for trains and ships. This one technology transformed the world. It enabled mass production, rapid transportation, urbanization, and ultimately, the modern global economy. Britain became the world superpower because they harnessed steam power first. But here's the haunting question. What if China had developed the steam engine in, say, 1200 CE instead of abandoning it? They had all the pieces. They had coal mines that needed pumping. They had canals that needed irrigation. They had a massive economy that could have benefited from mechanization. If China had developed steam power in the 1200s, they would have had a 500-year head start on the Industrial Revolution. Imagine Chinese steam-powered ships sailing to Europe in the 1300s. Imagine Chinese factories mass-producing goods while Europe was still in the medieval period. World history would be unrecognizable. But it didn't happen. Because the Confucian bureaucrats didn't see the value. Because the emperor didn't prioritize it. Because Chinese philosophy valued stability over innovation, tradition over progress, sufficiency over expansion. And here's the tragic irony. This same pattern, inventing something revolutionary and then abandoning it, happened with so many Chinese technologies that by the 1800s, when European powers arrived in China with guns, steamships, and industrial technology, they were using refined versions of inventions that China had created centuries earlier. The Opium Wars of the 1840s to 1860s, Britain defeated China using gunpowder weapons, invented in China. Britain forced trade using steamships, based on principles the Chinese could have developed. Britain's industrial economy produced the goods that flooded Chinese markets, using manufacturing techniques that Chinese metallurgy and engineering had pioneered. China was defeated by its own abandoned inventions. So what was the economic cost of China's lost innovations? Let's do some rough calculations. If China had continued Zheng He's voyages and established trade networks across Asia, Africa, and possibly the Americas, they would have controlled global trade routes worth trillions in today's money. Instead, European powers, Portugal, Spain, Netherlands, Britain, captured that trade. If China had industrialized in the 1200s or 1300s instead of the 1700s to 1800s, they would have had centuries of economic growth and development that never happened. Economists estimate this represents tens of trillions of dollars in lost GDP over the centuries. If China had maintained its technological lead instead of stagnating, the century of humiliation, the period from 1839 to 1949 when China was dominated by foreign powers, might never have happened. Here's a stark statistic. In 1820, China's economy represented about 33% of global GDP. By 1950, it had fallen to just 4.5%. That collapse from 1/3 of the world economy to 1/20th is unprecedented in history. And it happened because China stopped innovating while everyone else kept going. But here's where the story gets interesting. China remembers this. The Chinese government today is obsessed with technological development, innovation, and avoiding the mistakes of the past. China's current massive investments in technology, AI, quantum computing, renewable energy, space exploration, aren't just about economic growth. They're about never being left behind again. They're about never repeating the mistake of abandoning revolutionary technology. The Chinese government explicitly frames its technology policy as learning from history. They remember Zheng He's destroyed fleet. They remember the abandoned steam engine. They remember being defeated by their own inventions. And they're determined never to let it happen again. So what's the lesson from China's lost inventions? Here's what most people get wrong. They think China fell behind because they weren't innovative. That's not true. China was incredibly innovative. They invented more revolutionary technologies than any other civilization. China fell behind because they stopped innovating. They chose stability over progress. They chose tradition over change. They chose inward focus over outward expansion. And here's the universal lesson. Innovation isn't just about inventing things. It's about continuously developing them, scaling them, and using them to transform society. Britain didn't invent gunpowder, the compass, or the basic principles of the steam engine, but they developed these technologies relentlessly and used them to build an empire. The same principle applies today. The United States didn't invent most of the technology that powers the modern economy. Transistors were invented in multiple countries, the internet grew out of international research, smartphones use components from around the world. But America created the environment, competitive markets, venture capital, universities, immigration of talent, where these technologies could be rapidly developed and commercialized. China's lost inventions teach us that having great ideas isn't enough. You need a system that continuously develops those ideas, a culture that rewards innovation, and a willingness to embrace change, even when it's uncomfortable. The tragedy of Chinese innovation isn't that they couldn't invent the future. It's that they invented it and then walked away. In an alternate timeline, Zheng He's treasure fleet kept sailing. China industrialized in the 1300s. Chinese became the global language of trade, and the last 5 centuries of world history look completely different. But that's not what happened. China chose to stop, and by the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. Other civilizations had taken the technologies China abandoned and built empires with them. Today, China is making sure that never happens again. Whether that's good or bad for the rest of the world, we're about to find out. But the lesson is clear. The greatest risk isn't failing to innovate, it's innovating and then stopping. If this changed how you think about innovation in history, hit subscribe. We reveal the economic stories behind world-changing decisions every week. Drop a comment. What do you think would have happened if China had kept innovating? And share this with someone who needs to understand that having great ideas is only the beginning. Because the most expensive mistake isn't making the wrong choice. It's making the right choice and then walking away from it. I'll see you in the next one.